All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Well, hello, and welcome everybody to our Domestic Violence Awareness Month webinar series. We are so glad that you decided to join us here today and join on this amazing conversation. I hope this is not going to be your first and last time joining. We have a month long of awesome presentations by dynamic speakers from all over who are experts in the fields of advocacy and violence prevention. So please do stay tuned for email alerts, which will tell you what to expect within the next few coming weeks. We are joined here today by two esteemed, amazing guests. But before we get into all of that, my name is Araba Aduapau. I'm the Senior Research Specialist at Ujima, Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. And welcome in. Like I said before, please do type your name in the chat, your organization, and what you do. We'd love to get better acquainted with you. So without further ado, our first presenter, Alana Brown. Alana C. Brown, Esquire, is an award-winning attorney who has been fighting injustice for Black women survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence for the last 10 years. In 2018, Ms. Brown founded and currently serves as the executive director of the Safe Sister Circle, which provides culturally specific, trauma-informed, and holistic services for Black women survivors of sexual and domestic violence, living primarily in Washington, D.C., wards 7 and 8. Ms. Brown was selected as the 2022 Washingtonian of the Year by Washingtonian Magazine, congratulations, a distinction held by community heroes in the Washington, D.C. community for her work and its impact. She also received 2022's National Bar Association's Top 40 Under 40 Advocates Award. Additionally, Ms. Brown has published articles and spoken locally and nationally to various media outlets, including the Washington Post, regarding the systemic issues that Black women survivors experience in the intersectional areas of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and reproductive justice. Ms. Brown received her BA in Africana Studies, from New York University and her JD from Georgetown University Law Center. Our second presenter, Nel-Sylvia Guzman, Esquire, is the Deputy Director of the Safe Sisters Circle. Ms. Guzman has provided legal services on behalf of domestic violence survivors in DC for the last 5 years in both protection order and family court matters. At the Safe Sisters Circle, she has worked to expand their legal capacity, including establishing its community walk-in clinic hosted on a quarterly basis. She's a first-generation attorney for her family, getting there through graduating summa cum laude from West Virginia University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and with a law degree from the University of Virginia of Law. So without further ado, we will now get into our first presentation of our series.
Good morning, everyone. As said, my name is Alana Brown from the Safe Circle. I'm here with my colleague, Nel-Sylvia Guzman, our Deputy Director. So our presentation is going to be about creating, providing culture-specific direct legal services to Black women survivors as we do it through our organization, the Safe Sister Circle. So we have 4 objectives today. The first is to understand the landscape of domestic violence service providers in DC and why the Safe Sister Circle was created. To understand what culture-specific and culturally humble and culturally responsive legal services are and look like. To understand how Black women experience legal and justice system in unique ways and the culture-specific systems response to them. And to understand how culture-specific services can assist Black women survivors find freedom from violence and liberation from violence. So problem in GAFA services is that domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, Black women survivors in DC, as I saw it from working with white providers for the last 10 years, was that they were not receiving the best quality services. Their legal needs were not met. Their cultural problems were ignored. They were disrespected or had apathetic treatment to them, the same way Black women received in different ways. People didn't listen to their problems. People didn't respect them. People didn't hear them when they said what they wanted in their cases. And they felt they had lack of control over their own cases, that people were just telling them what to do. and telling them how to act towards cases instead of listening to what they actually wanted the case to happen and what they thought justice was. So I started my career as a district attorney, working with domestic violence, sexual assault cases in New York County. And as that and a former fellow volunteer, the white-led DVSA, Legal Service Survivors in DC, what I know when I'm talking about Black survivors, and the relationship with white legal service providers is based on experience, observation, and intuition. So it's not something I'm just making up or thinking like, I think this happens. It's based on what I've experienced, what I've seen, how I feel, and also what I've researched before starting this organization. So what do I know about the impact of white provider, Black survivor client dynamic? I know it's less impactful and efficient and quality services that don't take into account Black women and girls' true needs as survivors. They're not client-centered, they're not trauma-informed, and they do not work towards healing process for Black women. A lot of times they're just, bam, legal services, thank you, ma'am, and go about your business. And I'm thinking about the quality of the woman's life, the intersections of violence and poverty, the intersections of violence and racism, and how they need to heal from their abuse and trauma. So culture-specific services have proven to be more impactful than traditional counterparts, are more effective when led by a representative from the community being served. And this is what I found just looking at other culture-specific organizations and what I did during research, but what I've also found during the lifespan of the Safe Sister Circle. So in 2018, because I didn't see there was a service directly for Black women survivors in Washington, D.C. area, despite the fact that the majority of survivors in Washington, D.C. were Black women by far, there were no services for them directly. They were for Latinas and some for immigrants, but none for Black Americans or African Americans, or how we describe Black as the African diaspora survivors. So founded in 2018, I sought to make this impact and tailored our model of direct legal services to Black women survivors, domestic violence, and I focus on specifically high violence and majority Black areas. So I don't know who's familiar with Washington, D.C., but we focus mostly on Ward 7 or 8 and 8, and it's called the East of the River community. And it's interesting because it's geographically separate from the rest of DC. It's east of the Anacostia River. But east of the Anacostia River, there's 2 wards, because DC is into 8 wards that are majority Black, high violence, high poverty, low systems, low services. And that's where we decided to focus our services. That's where we felt like it was needed the most. And we also are located physically in Ward 7 to make sure that people can get good access to us. They don't have to go downtown to get legal services. They can go to their own communities and get legal services. So our mission is to provide culture-specific, trauma-informed, and holistic services to Black women and girl survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, living primarily in Washington, D.C.'s Ward 7, 8. So our model is culturally specific, it's to be holistic, it's to be trauma-informed and community-based within the Ward 7 and Ward 8 community. Nel-Sylvia is going to get into more what that means in terms of culture-specific and how we apply it to our clients, but also we've all been trained in trauma-informed, how to react to survivors of trauma. We try to provide holistic services. So besides just legal services, we provide ancillary services such as grocery gift cards, Lyft rides, food, pantries, different things like that to help our clients out, because we know that legal is not where it's just where it begins, not where it ends. And we try to be in community. Like I said, we're located in Ward 7, which is close to Ward 7 and 8, because we want to be part of the community. So they know us and they're comfortable with us, and most importantly, they trust us. So those just interested in starting their own culture-specific organization for legal services or whatever you're thinking of, I think you need to have faith in your lived experiences. You need to conduct research and needs assessment of the community that you're working with. You need to ask the community you're trying to serve what they're looking for in a provider. I sat down beforehand, started this organization, different little listening sessions in Anacostia Arts Center and hairdressers and different churches, and just spoke to people and asked them, what were they looking for in legal providers? What was their definition of justice? What do they think that legal services look like to them? To find support, mentors, and allies, specifically people who look like you, would be my recommendation, and utilize social media platforms.
Thanks, Alana. So I'm going to get into deeper of what specifically we mean when we say culturally specific services. At the Safe Sister Circle, we strive to make sure our services are culturally specific, culturally humble, and culturally responsive. And what we mean by that is when we say culturally specific, we're talking about services that are from an individual that's from the same community that creates a comfortable environment where trust is established. When we are speaking of cultural humility, we're creating an environment that allows the client to sustain who they are within a cultural context and essentially show up as their authentic self. And then when we say we're culturally responsive, we are sensitive and understanding in our approach that our goal for the client is to thrive, not just survive, really getting into our holistic model. An example of how the need for culturally specific services are the story of Tamara. Tamara sought a civil protection order in DC from her ex-boyfriend. After an attempt to negotiate, the case went to a trial where both Tamara and her abuser testified as to what happened and the instances of abuse. At the end of the trial, the judge found that Tamara had met the civil burden to get a protection order, which normally would mean that she would get one and have some type of protection for at least a year. But ultimately, the judge decided she wasn't going to award Tamara one. And her reason behind it was, although she met the burden, she didn't believe Tamara's story. And what was very frustrating about that case in particular was not only did Tamara testify, but there was also evidence to support her case, including the 911 call she made in the midst of one of the physical altercations, and she had pictures of her injury. But the judge focus was so on whether Tamara herself was believable that the judge disregarded the additional evidence that supported her claims. And the verdict itself of not providing Tamara with a civil protection order is indicative of long-held negative stereotypes and narratives about Black women. There's a history of denial of Black women's victimhood. They're often looked at as liars and can't be trusted. Tamara's behavior was typical for a traumatized survivor, and you could hear that very well in the 911 call, but it was used against her in court as proof of dishonesty. Her story is an example of how Black women's words, emotions, and physical abuse are ignored by society. Culturally specific services matter because we want our clients to be able to be their authentic self when they meet us. They've already endured a trauma, so we want to give them a comfortable experience when working with our attorneys. And an example of that is allowing our clients to tell their story without code switching. That brings me to Michelle's story. In preparing Michelle for her custody trial, she walks through the instances of abuse that occurred while she was pregnant. Michelle, when talking about one particular day, mentions that her child's father yoked her up on the side of the car. Because of our culturally specific services, she's able to finish her story without pausing to explain what it means to yoke someone up. But afterwards, the attorney is able to ask follow-up questions to explain to a court what that means and even have her demonstrate what it meant to be yoked up in one simple line of questioning. And this is important because of Black women's experience in the courtroom. Oftentimes, telling their authentic story is misunderstood, or their abuse may be acknowledged, but they're told by the courts that they have to learn to get along for any of the shared children's sake. Also, history of abuse is often questioned for Black women if police have never been called or reports have ever been made, although the deeper understanding of why a Black woman may not call the police is never addressed. And then one of the larger issues that we see is that the Black women aren't seen as the perfect victims. If they're in an argument with their abuser prior to a physical altercation, it's more, well, you should have just walked away, instead of the physical violence is the problem. With cultural specific legal services, as legal advocates, we believe at the Safe Sister Circle that in order to provide the best legal representation and advice to our clients is that we have to apply an intersectional approach to our trauma lens. We are trauma informed at our organization, but being trauma informed also means understanding that a woman's trauma is more than just the abuse that they experienced. It's their abuse layered on being Black in America, being Black in Washington, D.C., or being a Black woman that lives in Ward 7 or 8. We also address issues and cultural hesitations in their journey, understanding why, again, a Black woman may not engage with law enforcement, why they may not engage with the criminal justice system generally and just want to get a protection order so that an abuser will leave them alone. We have to acknowledge assumptions and stereotypes that are in the systems that we're fighting against, navigate bias, and then reframing colloquialism and testimony. As domestic and sexual assault advocates, many of the same ideas that are being applied for legal services can be applied as just as a domestic violence or sexual assault advocate in a non-legal space. And this may look, again, as the avoidance of law enforcement. If a client is not comfortable with police contact, not pushing them to make a report, shaming them for not calling, or including that into a safety plan. It's acknowledging racialized tropes, trying to avoid victim blaming or making the survivor feel that it's her fault because she's seen as the angry Black woman. It's addressing the intersectional trauma of allowing the survivor the space to be vulnerable and take their cape off, letting them know they don't have to be superwoman. And then it's also addressing African-American slang and AAVE of, not forcing a survivor to change their authentic story, allowing them to tell their story as they would, but helping them translate it for whoever who may not know what they mean. The impact that we've seen specifically at the Safe Sister Circle is our work with survivors. Survivors have been able to get freedom from the various forms of abuse. They've been able to get physical boundaries set for clients, whether it's a civil protection order, if they do go the criminal route, it's getting criminal stay away, or being very cognizant in the parenting plans and custody settlements to make sure that there's protection for the survivors so that visitation exchanges or conversations that are supposed to be centered around the child that's shared aren't used as further mechanisms of abuse. The impact is also boundary setting. It protects children in extreme abuse cases from witnessing domestic violence in their homes. Many studies have shown that the mental and psychological impact of witnessing domestic violence, especially at a young age. So trying to set those boundaries so that our clients' children aren't experiencing that, which oftentimes our own clients experienced as children, trying to end that cycle. Many survivor clients thrive after our representation. We work to help them find new safe housing, to further their education and elevate their careers in getting mental health assistance. That's going to be further done within our organization as we're working to get a culturally specific counseling program off the ground for our clients. We also hope that through our work that the abuser's behavior will change in Washington, D.C. through the civil protection order process. You are allowed to ask for an abuser to attend specific classes, which may be anger management, parenting, domestic violence generally, drug or alcohol abuse. Through those courses, our hope is that the abuser will address what's their root cause of why they are committing instances of domestic violence and hopefully change that behavior for the better in the future. And then there's the long-term community benefit of that itself. With behavioral and cultural changes, we'll decrease the abuser's violence generally, even outside of domestic violence and sexual assault scenarios. And with that, hopefully improve the quality of life within Wards 7 and 8 that we focus on specifically. So culturally specific legal services are transformative. The foundation of a culturally legal service is not only listening to what our clients tell us, but understanding what is unspoken. Because we allow our clients' lived experience to drive the work that we do, we create our programming off of that. In the near future, the Safe Sister Circle is looking to establish a restorative justice program. I spoke a lot in the earlier part of the slides about the adverse reaction to law enforcement. We have heard time and time again from a lot of our clients that they don't want to involve law enforcement for various reasons. They're not trauma informed in themselves, so it often escalates situations. There have been times where our clients have been falsely arrested in a domestic abuse dispute. There have been times also where Black women just don't want to see another Black man or Black person whom they're dating end up in the incarceration system. So with that, we have decided that a restorative justice program, giving an alternate form of what justice can look like, can be beneficial for our clients. Another programming that we are hoping to get off the ground in the near future is a survivor advocacy board. Through that, survivors will be able to specifically voice, Black women survivors will be able to specifically voice their concerns on the systems that they're interacting with on a daily basis, whether it's the court system, law enforcement officers, even some of the legislation that might be created or being drafted by our city council. We want to make sure that Black women survivors, especially those in Ward 7 and 8 that are not given the opportunity to have their voice at these tables, to really speak to their lived experience and how their lived experience can change these systems, give them that opportunity, give them the training and support that they need to be advocates even further for themselves. And ultimately, our program is just to continue to support Black women survivors in the way they want to be supported. And that's ultimately the goal of any culturally specific service that is presented. Any questions?
Yeah, so to everyone in the chat, this is the time. If you had any questions during the presentation that came up for you, please feel free to just type them in the chat, and Alana and Nel-Sylvia will be more than happy to answer. So we'll just give it a few minutes or so.
Araba, there's a question from Anna, I believe, that came through.
Okay. So the question reads, do you have a sense of what your restorative justice program will look like?
So yes, we do. We've been working with someone who started Restorative DC, because in DC, there's actually some restorative justice programs within the DC public school system and with the Office of Attorney General's office. And basically, we want to do it community-based, and a space is not our permanent office, but space within the Ward 7 or 8 area where the abuser or the harm doer and the harmed get together and discuss like the situation and hold the harm doer accountable for their actions by the person who was harmed and by the community. And to do this by having a facilitator who, we assume will be a Black woman facilitator who will be trained by the person who started Restorative DC. And it's going to be a long process, about, I think, 6 to 8 month process for everyone to be counseled and trained and to talk about the situation to get to the very end. And the end is like, there's no real goal to restore justice. Like, no one's going to end up in jail or anything. But the goal is to hold the person accountable and let the person who was harmed feel like they receive some type of justice. And really, hopefully the person that did the harm will not repeat the harm again, or understand what they did to that person, understand the harm they created for themselves, for the person, and for the community, and have the community hold them accountable as well. And we're going to start with a smaller scale in terms of more of like a trial project instead of something really big, just because in terms of our capacity as a program and funding.
Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be a one-off meeting. It'll be a 6-month to 1 year long process that builds up with various, one-on-one meetings with the leader, the restorative justice leader, and the survivor, one-on-one meetings with the abuser and the leader before we even get to a point to put them in the same room.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a comment and a question in the chat. So Kay Hamlin says, good morning. I got on this call because of the hesitancy around law enforcement is overlooked in maternal health and who shows up at the hospital. Kay Hamlin also asks, what are legal services strategies that work around that issue if they never reported abuse?
I think one strategy, and it's, yes, this is actually a very common issue that we've heard even with some of our clients, is, if it's to a point where a survivor is able to get at least civil protection order beforehand for any abuse that happens before the child's born, that automatically is going to protect them in the instance of being in labor. But I think, there have been times where there's even been incidents inside of the delivery room where the abuser will start getting aggressive while she's in the midst of labor. And with those, it's having a strong advocate in the healthcare system and getting them trained on what warning signs to look for, when they can find ways to de-escalate and call in security if necessary, and listening to the mother as she's in labor of what she wants. And with that, it can be asking him to leave the room, and if he doesn't, calling in security in that instance. But I think a lot of it also, as I noted, is if there's not anything already in place, it's really making sure that advocates in the room, whether it's a nurse, whether it's a doula or somebody that can help advocate on behalf of the mother. I hope that answers.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have a question from Jeanette in the chat. I'm wondering, how can we better assist women of color during the criminal justice process when judges and other court officials are not trauma informed? For instance, a victim who has experienced trauma might be re-traumatized and perhaps goes into the fight response. Of course, this may look aggressive to some people, but they are unaware that this is a trauma response.
So this is what I was part of the criminal legal system at one point. As I said, I started my career as a prosecutor working on these type of cases. And that was the issue, is that people would be triggered a lot of times by these cases. And sometimes putting them on the stand would re-traumatize them. So they'd be traumatized for the event. They'd be traumatized when you prep them for trial. And they'd be third time traumatized for testifying. And people would also, the people in my office would use people's aggressive tendencies to say, like, maybe they're not victims, or maybe they're not survivors. Maybe they did start the fight with the abuser, and they use it kind of against them, even though they're supposed to be representing their interests or the interests of the state. And I think it needs to set people, this training to tell people, like, people react differently, and people could culturally react differently to certain incidents. As a Black woman, you may feel like you have to be a strong Black woman. You have to fight back. You have to be aggressive to get to fight against abuse coming your way, that a white woman might not need to be, because she's allowed to be a victim. She's allowed to be soft and vulnerable in a way that the criminal system, whether it be the prosecutors and judge, don't really understand. So I think one good thing I saw one time was someone brought a psychologist to testify. This is a really big case that was not like a case that I was handling, just to testify about culture-specific norms in different cultures. It was a Latina survivor. about this Latino culture, how people respond to violence, and how the community responds to violence, the community responds to violence. So I think getting an expert sometimes would be helpful if you can. It's hard if you're a nonprofit to get funding for an expert, but I think that also in some ways helps.
Mhm. And to build on that, I would also say it's really about finding your way to frame why the client is acting that way, even if it's just a passing remark, as the case is ending, like, we're sorry, Your Honor, for the outburst. This is a very emotional, her fear is very real as she's trying to show, and really just trying to find ways to reframe anything that from the outside looking in looks negative. That's, I think, one of the major things that we do in our space is finding ways to reframe everything, whether it's their words, their actions, to show that this is the reason why it's happening.
Change the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. We had a raised hand from Ayana. So Ayana, go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question because I was thinking about this last question that was just asked about like trauma. I've worked with programs before that for them, mandated reporting was a little murky. And I know that's like that's a whole nother webinar potentially, but can you give any thoughts around like, especially for adult survivors, why just automatic mandated reporting is not actually the most helpful or safest, and like what people can do instead? Because I know a lot of folks are concerned about liability or just making sure they're getting survivors connected when they go into the hospital, for instance. But can you give us some thoughts?
I think that's hard for us to say because we have confidentiality, the client legal confidentiality that we automatically get. We don't have to report anyone. We don't have any reporting standards for adults nor children to report stuff to us. So the standards for advocates are very different from attorneys. What I would say would be the lack of trust. Like if you were an advocate and someone told you something traumatic or something that was vulnerable to them, and then you went and reported to a prosecutor or report to, I guess, a victim advocacy line or 911 line, that we would lose the trust of them. And I think trust is the most important aspect in developing relationships with clients. They have to be able to trust that you're going to look out for them, trust what they tell you stays between you and them. And then if once they lose that trust, they don't want to do anything with you anymore. And you can no longer help them once you lose that trust. So you pretty much just lost the case or lost the issue that you're dealing with that particular person. But again, we have different standards because we're lawyers. We have our own confidentiality standards that are a little bit stronger than I think advocates get.
Thank you. We do have at least 2 more questions. And of course, if any other questions come up for folks, feel free to type them in the chat. So Dr. Quincy asks, are you able to receive funding to create these culturally responsive positions, considering most funding is linked to the mainstream non-responsive orgs? What does the sustainability of these positions look like long-term?
So yes, there are culture-specific grants out there. One specifically, Ujima is a funder for us for a culture-specific grant for Black women survivors of domestic violence through a federal grant, I believe. So there are specific grants you can apply for. Also with Office of Violence Against Women, they have a culture-specific grant for services that are for people of color, women of color. If you're interested in looking into it, I mean, they're very difficult grants and they're long to apply to, but they do exist. And sometimes you have local foundations. Our biggest supporters are probably local foundations that just know about the area, know that Black women are one of the most affected in DC, know that they're the ones who are abused the most and want to help out the most harmed. And so they come to us or we go to them asking for funding and they give it to us, understanding the problem, understanding the circumstances of the community that they work in and live in. But yes, sustainability of positions is to get, a foundational grant that's long, that kind of continues every year, that kind of re-ups every year, or governmental grants that's the same, or if you could get a multi-year grant, that would be the best thing to do. We have one of those, but it's our first one, but thus far we've been able to get grants that have been renewed every year. We've been existing for 6 years in March. So we've been pretty sustainable with that, but I think you all have to grow within your capacity and, have to grow within what you have, think very strategically how you spend your money and how you raise your money and what the money's going towards.
Thank you. I do have a question coming in from Miranda Shorts, and also maybe we can talk a little bit later about your suggestions and advice to lawyers and Black advocates and how they navigate bias within the workspace. So the question reads, for those who don't believe restorative practices work, how do you navigate working in a space that may not promote or agree with restorative or transformative justice practices?
I mean, I think most spaces don't agree with it. I think the mainstream does not agree with it. I think as an organization, as I started the organization, and as an organization, we've pretty much been not mainstream. It's kind of expected, like we're going to do what we authentically think is right for the people we represent and our survivors. And if the mainstream feels like, well, that's not right, or that's not a real way to help survivors, or that's letting offenders get off easily, that's their opinion. That doesn't mean that's at the end of the day what's right or wrong for the survivor. So I think most people, depending on where you are, could be, well, I mean, DC is a progressive area for most places. But even in progressive areas like DC, it's still really progressive to want restorative justice programs. It's still been really hard to get funding. It's still really hard to get people on your side about it, to get it fully restorative justice that aren't related to the criminal justice system whatsoever. So I think it's just, you're going to have to be kind of against the grain of that one and believe in what you believe and have the evidence to prove that it works and the research to prove that it works. And to, look at other programs that already have done it before you.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we're also starting as a pilot, starting smaller so that we have the space to really establish the reason behind the need for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I see you've put up your contact info so folks can stay in touch with you. Just to kind of close this out, can you tell us a little bit more about Black lawyers navigating bias and microaggressions, like what you've seen, maybe drawing from what you've experienced yourself, and what is some advice to Black advocates and lawyers?
When I worked, I didn't see microaggressions. I saw strong aggressions against Black women and very open racism in the courtroom and within the office I worked in and other offices I worked in. But I would say find a mentor who works within the office that looks like you, a Black woman mentor to really look out for you. But also I would say, and I know I don't want to sound flippant when I say this, but it probably is not the right organization or office for you. Like if you're in a toxic environment, because I always told, like, if you don't grow or you're not an organization that invests in you, not investing in your growth, not investing in your leadership, not investing in your training, then they're just getting all this work out of you for free. Like, what are you getting in return from the organization, from the law firm, from the prosecutor's office? Make sure you're getting something in return from them. They make an investment in you. If they don't invest in you, there's someone out there who will invest in you, because you're a Black woman attorney. You've been through a hard stuff, and you've passed, most of the stereotypes. You've passed most of the bridges. You've passed the bar. Now you're looking for jobs. So you're a badass woman, basically. And you know that you can handle anything. So if you're in an organization that these microaggressions keep coming up, it's probably time for you to maybe look for another spot where there's not as many microaggressions. But I always say look for someone who has the same position as you or where you want to be. Like, my mentor is executive director of another gender-based violence organization in DC, and that's what I look up to when I have questions, when there are microaggressions within the nonprofit community in general, which there are. It's very white woman-run, legal-based community in DC. And I also think you should, also get therapy and do some self-care.
Yeah, Alana took one of my main ones. I came from the law firm world before getting into the nonprofit space, where microaggressions are a very commonplace, even for the most, well-meaning person. But I think if it gets to the point where you, as Alana said, you're not seeing investment in you, then that's not the place for you. Because at the end of the day, as we tell our clients, you do not need to be Superwoman all the time. You don't have to grin and bear it and take the brunt of things just because it feels like what needs to be done. we got to where we are as lawyers, as Black women generally, against many odds. And it's leaning into that power and understanding that if it doesn't serve you, then, you know, you're not going to serve it anymore. Finding a place that is a safe space for you to be authentic, where they care about your wellness. It may be hard to find, but they're out there. I mean, I found it here at the Safe Sister Circle, and it definitely changes your passion of your work, because at the end of the day, many of us will say the microaggressions lead into burnout, and then you start to lose a passion for the work that you're doing. And then now we're losing what could be one of the next best lawyers. So when you feel like it's getting too much, that's your cue to go.
I'm happy you mentioned burnout, Nel-Sylvia, because that's one of the the words that came to mind when hearing you speak about this. And I think not only can Black lawyers relate, but Black advocates in general in any field, in any work, I think navigating microaggressions, whether they're like Alana said, not micro, but like in your face aggression, right? It can be difficult. And so I'm wondering, what does self-care look like to you? How have you practiced self-care? How have you head on faced negative tropes and stereotypes that may impact you in your work? Because I think like we don't talk about that enough, right? How to kind of keep ourselves grounded. I think we always try to take the professional and diplomatic route, but what are some things we can do to kind of center ourselves within this work?
It's like Alana said, therapy. Therapy is, I think, it's still a bit taboo in the Black culture, but finding a therapist that will support you, if you can find a Black woman therapist, even better, really, really helps with that self-care and making sure you're not internalizing a lot of what you're hearing. Remembering the things that you do for fun and trying to find time for that. We oftentimes will push those things off, especially for work, but trying to carve out, even if it is just for 30 minutes a day, like something that brings you joy, are two of my main ones that come to mind.
I think also keeping healthy boundaries between you and the people you service. I think it's very easy if you're a person who's passionate about this work and cares a lot about people. It's very easy to let that line of like client slash friend get blurred a lot of times. Like you're my client, you're not my sister, you're not my girlfriend, you're my client. But I still love you, but you're my client. And make sure to keep those boundaries separate, and so you don't get too emotionally involved that you lose your perspective as an attorney or as an advocate, that you can be objective. And I also would say we have someone come in our office once a month. We'll come virtually into our office once a month to do mindfulness and to talk with people about traumatic and vicarious trauma. Who comes in once a month to talk to people about that. And we also will provide insurance that people can get healthcare to get that therapy.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, last but not least, we have a question from Tiara Jackson. She asks, are the trainings for the restorative justice program for anyone to join? I live in Indiana, but would love to take the training.
I could say that there are ones nationally, but if you wanted to do the info at safecycircle.org and email me, I could put you in contact with someone who would tell you where in your area you can find it. I put you in contact with Tariq, who's the person who runs it in DC. He pretty much knows all the justice programs across the United States. He would probably know who to tell you to get training from.
Got it. Got it. And before we go, I would hate to leave people without resources. So just a question on any helpful resources or readings that have helped you in your work, like, and also any policy or law updates that are specific to DV survivors that folks should be aware of.
I think I think there's a Tracy M. Good with GODE is a scholar who does a lot of reports and investigations and research on Black women and domestic violence in the United States. I think just getting to know her knowledge and what she knows and reading her articles would be very helpful if you want to get involved in this work too. You're not just saying what you think. It's like you have research backing up what you believe and what you think. And it gives you nuances, nuanced experiences and nuanced ideas. I think I'm reading right now, Say Her Name, about the police state violence against Black women that was brought out by Kimberly Crenshaw. Because I think that personally, that's a big problem that we have is like violence against Black women by the police, by the state. And that's why Black women don't trust the state necessarily to do criminal services for domestic violence survivors. Also check out Office of Violence Against Women, the UN International Rights for Women. They have a lot of rules and restrictions that come up every year that talks about the state of the Black woman and domestic violence that I think is really interesting, both nationally and internationally.
I think the one law or things that are related to domestic violence that come to mind is next month on this November 7th, the Supreme Court will be hearing the case out of Texas related to whether protection orders are allowed to take away a person's rights to bear arm, as the other side has been putting it. Essentially, in many protection orders across the country, if you have been found guilty in a criminal case or have a protection order against you that's domestic violence related, you're not allowed to own a firearm of any sort. And that currently is being challenged in the Supreme Court, and we are hopeful that they will allow that provision to be upheld, because we know that especially in the Black community, the issues with firearm are great, and survivors generally, that is a large percentage of domestic violence related issues are related to firearms and homicides from them.
Nice. Gotcha. And Alana, just for clarification, the author that you mentioned, would you be able to restate that name again? Someone was
Let
trying
me send you, Araba, a list of resources, because I do actually have a list for another presentation that I did that I think would be good. I could just send it to you, you can forward to other participants. Would that be able to happen?
Yes, that works. So if you funnel those resources to me, and I hope this answers your question, Samantha Williams in the chat, we'll definitely disperse that information so that you guys have not missed anything. Okay. Oh, and I just like to read this comment. I think it's a resource that may be helpful to everyone else. But Lauren says, here in Michigan, we have a program called Creating Presence that allows us the ability to bring mindfulness to our organization and effective trauma-informed care practices. We also have Sasha Center, which is a freedom program for African-American identified survivors of assault and rape. So just throwing that resource out there as well.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Halima from Sasha Center. She is one of the mentors I spoke about to look at someone who wants to do something that you want to do, a culture specific Black representation and sexual assault in Michigan, in Detroit, right? So that speaks to also like when you get your organization, find someone who's doing what you want to do and try to like reach out to them and speak to them and get to know what they're doing and why they're doing it and how you can do it as well.
Yeah. And just, I'm sorry, these things are just kind of popping up, but do you have hopes for the work and for Black survivors?
I do. I think, it's something we had to push through. I think he wouldn't do it if he didn't have any hope. I think he would just give up and just be sad. But I think things, as we grow as a society, as we gain more power, as we are allowed to represent ourselves and to speak for ourselves, we're able to get better end results. But I think it's the whole white savior, white woman savior, white person, Black dynamic just doesn't work anymore in any of the fields that work within domestic or sexual violence. I think we have to do it for ourselves. And there's a coalition of women of color who are doing it in this line of work, who are trying to like make it just a movement of like change. So I do think there's a chance that once this change gets going, it will have a domino effect on the system and we'll get better results. Hopefully the system, hopefully the criminal system, but definitely the civil legal system and the laws and how people are treated within the court system.
I love that. Nel-Sylvia?
Yeah, I mean, we as Black women are being loud about what we want and what we need, as advocates and as survivors. And it's starting to become to a point where we can't be ignored by these systems. So they're learning that they have to find ways to adapt to better support all survivors. It's still going to be a long process, but as Alana said, I think if we weren't passionate about this, none of us would even be on this call today. So we're just going to keep fighting the good fight until we can't fight anymore.
Awesome. And I'm going to read this comment because I love it so much. Dr. Quincy says, this has been great. Some of us are doing our due diligence as men to engage Black men and boys in this work, and we see you. So that's awesome to hear, and keep on going, Dr. Quincy. We just believe in engaging all members of society in this work. And so I really did love that comment. Well, I want to thank the both of you so very much for this awesome presentation. So many great takeaways. I know just by judging the comments and questions that we've had in the chat, I can tell people are really engaged and interested in how to further this work. And also just a reminder, I will be sharing the resources that were mentioned in today's discussion, just in case you were not able to capture any of them. So please do not fret. And also want to remind you all to join our 3 p.m. Workshop presentation as well. We have Maya White, who will be presenting on what it means to be a Black advocate, challenges of racism in the workplace. That should be a great and awesome presentation. So we hope to see you at 3 p.m. I just dropped the link in the chat, so please use that and do not miss out on a great workshop. And please do write down the contact info as seen on the screen. So if there are any questions and comments that were not addressed in today's presentation, you have their info and can ask them directly. And thank you guys so much. We hope to see you again this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.